When you decided to write Kawa Korwa, how did you actually come to the decision of this piece with this concept?
A lot of trial and error. I knew I wanted to write a piece about snow in some form because it fit into the greater structure of my song cycle, but I didn't know what language I wanted to write a piece in snow in. And so I thought, well, what cultures have to deal with snow quite a bit? And I sort of racked my brain and I thought, well, maybe, like something like Icelandic. But then I was doing another piece called Hafgenga Hríðum, in Old Norse, which is about hurricanes. So I thought, well, I better not get both in like an Old Norse piece and something Icelandic. So I thought, well, maybe something in the Inuit cultures, or I was looking at Yupik in particular as a language. And I did a lot of research, and I contacted the Alaskan Native Heritage Center and asked them for people who specialized, who spoke Yupik and maybe knew literature or songs in Yupik. And I did a lot of research and then went back and forth for weeks on end, and ultimately I couldn't find anything that served well as a text to set for a song about snow. I mean, maybe snow is such a mundane topic to people who live that far up north that they don't actually write about it very often.
But it's interesting because there are so many words in languages like Inuit and
it's true.
for snow.
It's true. Yeah. I mean,
But it's not a literary language.
It's not a literary language. There's an oral tradition that's passed down, but there isn't a lot of stuff that I could just Google and say, oh, there's a Yupik poem about snow. And the other problem is, one of the big challenges in doing concept albums like this, is not only do you have to find the language that's appropriate to the theme of the piece that you're writing, but you also have to find a culture where there is a strong vocal tradition that you can also tap into to use for this particular piece. So in the case of Yupik, there wasn't much of like something that you would think of as like a vocal tradition that stands out much in the way that, like, say, South African gospel would, or Bulgarian women's choirs, or Peking opera, things like that. These sort of vocal traditions that have existed in a lot of the other cultures that I've worked in. So I then thought, well, what about doing something in Tibetan? Because I was aware of this Tibetan singer, Young Chen Lamo, and I actually have some of her albums, and I thought, well, she's fantastic, and lots of snow in Tibet. And there was much deeper of a literary tradition that I could research there, and much more accessible of one, too.
But this has presented its own challenges as well.
It has. Well, just tracking down, actually finding references to snow in Tibetan texts wasn't that hard. And so ultimately I found this text by Milarepa, who is I believe an 11th century yogi, mystic and poet, who basically wrote about his struggles. And his writings became kind of a part of the canon of Tibetan Buddhism. And I found translations in English of his works. That wasn't hard. They're everywhere. The problem was then finding the original Tibetan. And to do that, at first I tried, rather foolishly, to scour the libraries of UCLA. I would go into the library and I would go into their Tibetan literature section and I'd pull out these books, and then very quickly I realized I have no clue what I'm looking at because it's written in Tibetan script, right? Which is, and I tried, like, okay, well, let's work it out phonetically, let's see if we can figure out, and this is how the transliteration for the word snow is written, so let's see if we can work it out. Quickly gave up on that. But then what I did after that is I found a Tibetan scholar at a university and basically wrote him a nice email and said, this is what I'm trying to do. Can you please help me? And so he was able to do that. And
well, you've opened a lot of doors through those kinds of emails for lots of your projects.
I reach out to a lot of people.
Well, and I mean, you've chosen for yourself this path of, okay, I'm going to write these pieces in all of these obscure languages from these obscure cultures. Let's make it as difficult as I can. So
yeah.
But I think what you're doing is connecting to people who are really happy to be connected to talk about these the culture that they represent.
I think so. I mean, I think generally people are very interested in the projects that I do. I mean, I was able to do Calling All Dawns because I was a complete nobody, and, you know, I was putting together Calling All Dawns. Gosh, it was like 6-7 years ago, and I was reaching out to these artists who have, you know, just these amazing careers and who have been in working music for so long. And I think the idea of what I was trying to do intrigued them enough such that they would be willing to participate. I mean, otherwise, why would Frederica von Stade sing a piece of a random composer, you know? Or Dulce Pontes, or the Soweto Gospel Choir? They all thought it was just kind of a cool idea, and they said, yeah, let's do it. So on one hand, it's kind of a blessing that I chose to do albums like this, like high concept albums with an international cast and a big, rich, you know, symphonic sound. On the other hand, not a day goes by that I don't wish, man, I wish I were like a indie folk pop singer with my guitar playing in a coffee house, you know, writing about, you know, interesting observations about mundane life, rather than running around the world, you know, sleeping on planes, living in hotel rooms, you know, just the logistics of what I do is just so hard.
But just imagine all of those indie guitar players and singers who wish they could be running around the world and doing the kind of thing.
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe.
Grass is
they do.
always greener.
Maybe. Maybe. Sometimes I sit in the coffee shop and think, man, you have it so easy. You know? But I think you were smart. You didn't pick this ridiculously challenging format to work in.
Well, how did you get into composing in the first place? When did was there something that happened when you were a kid, or something you thought, you know, I bet I have music in me and I'd like to get it out on paper?
I think what happened was I always had a strong music theory background. I had a piano teacher who from a very early age saw that I was really into music theory and started teaching me music theory, and then improvisation, you know, first through like blues and boogie woogie and things like that, and then through jazz. And so I had a very good, you know, I always thought I knew I had a very good ear and a very good internal ear for putting things together. And it happened in high school that I made the jump from just understanding music theory to actually composing music. And it was a number of factors, but I was just really into music back then, of all flavors, you know, classical, musical theater, classic rock. I grew up in Northern California, so everyone listened to Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, the Grateful Dead. I mean,
right.
You know, a lot of the bands that actually influenced the way that I approached making albums. Because back then, these guys made albums like Tommy or Quadrophenia or Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall, you know, the concept albums, high concept albums. And I thought, this is really great, I really like it. It gave me a sense of identity in high school, which is something that a lot of people grasp for. You know, who are you? Are you the captain of the football team? Are you the nerd? Who are you? You know, I was the young composer.
Well, you wound up writing a musical.
I did, in high school. That was one of the first things I wrote. It was a musical. And it really gave me a taste of what it felt like to conceive a big, ambitious project and then to execute it and to see it, you know, evolve and then hit the stage. And so I was sort of hooked on that feeling after that.
There's a song in there somewhere.
Hooked on a feeling. I am the lead.
As you've been coming into contact with all of these different cultures and exploring ways that you can express their culture in your music, have you been surprised by anything?
Yes, all sorts of things. Because I approach music in a very sort of cerebral, intellectual, X's and O's, you know, coordinates on a plane manner. And sometimes I forget that that is completely foreign to a lot of the people that I work with. So.
Because the singing tradition for them is not academic.
It's not academic. It's not about, you know, counterpoint. It's not about harmony. It's not about, you know, how do you structure your phrases or how. It's about expressing something, like a feeling or an emotion or an energy in some cases. Mm-hmm. And so there have been some singers that I've worked with. For example, Yongchen Lamo, who I've spoken with a couple on the phone with a couple of times. When I talk to her about music, it's not about notes. It's not about rhythms. Mm-hmm. It's about the energy that she's expressing when she sings. And so for me to wrap my head around that, it requires a big shift in the way that I think myself. So it's always a challenge.
So does that change the way that you research some of these, or is it mostly a change when you actually come into contact with somebody that you're trying to get music from?
Well, a lot of times it's a change in the way that I approach the particular project. So, I mean, unfortunately, what it comes down to is a lot of times you are just limited by the logistics and the schedule of how you're trying to do something. So in this particular case, I actually had a hard time reaching Young Chen Lamo for a while. And I would have loved to have reached her first before I started writing and then talking to her about music. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and I was on a deadline to write the piece to send to you guys. But a lot of times, it just shapes the way that I'll work on a piece. So with Calling All Dawns, I wrote the entire album out, recorded all of the orchestra, then presented it to the singers and said, would you sing the vocals over this, right? Which was one way of doing it. But this time, I've been doing it differently. A lot of times I've been writing the vocal parts, sending them to the singers, many of whom can't read music.
Right.
And then recording them first, and then writing the orchestral parts around the vocals. So it's a completely different way of working, but I like it because I'm more adaptive to what they're good at doing. And likewise, in the recording studio, what I found is it's always best to just let the singers work in whatever fashion that they are most comfortable working in. And with some singers, they want to see the notes, they want to see the sheet music, they want to know exactly what dynamic they decrescendo to, things like that. With some singers, they just want to make up their own stuff and just go to town. And when that happens, you just let them do it. You turn on the microphone and say,
go,
do your thing, and I will adapt later on. So it's a very fluid way of working. Every situation is different depending on the singer, depending on the vocal tradition.
Well, that must keep you more fresh as a composer that way, instead of finding yourself in a particular procedural rut of how you always conceive and put together a piece. You're forced to come at it from different points of view in different ways.
Well, procedural ruts have never been a problem for me because there are so many, like well, first of all, I've worked on a lot of different types of projects over the years, from releasing my own albums to concert music to writing musical theater, which requires collaborators, to scoring films, to scoring video games, which require a different set of logistical challenges, to commercials, to even making startup logos for Microsoft. I mean, everything, right? So it's never a problem where I feel like, oh, I'm doing the same thing over and over again. That would be a blessing in my case, because then I could rely on the same tricks over and over again. Oh, this is how you start off a piece.
Right.
Don't be intimidated by this blank canvas. Just sit down, do your thing.
Well, that's a part of what I'm saying. I mean, you're forced into creativity.
I'm forced into doing it, and it's good in that it does keep me fresh.
Yeah.
What's frustrating is every time you start a project, you think, oh my God, am I going to be able to do this? I've never had to deal with this before. How will I survive this? This is going to be a complete wreck. How, whatever. But you deal with it. You cope with it. So, and then there's just the logistics of day-to-day life. I mean, much of this particular album was written, frankly, on a laptop, on planes, in hotel rooms, in the living rooms of people's, friends that I've been crashing with. I mean, it just comes down to the limitations of time and scheduling, especially as my life has gotten more busy, and I find myself heading on the road more. I mean, you just have to adapt.
Yeah, it takes a tremendous amount of initiative and belief that what you have to say is worth saying,
right,
and that people want to hear it.
You have to believe in that, otherwise, why would you start? Yeah.
What is the challenge of putting something together? I mean, when you write your album, you have in mind the fact that you're going to be flying to London and conducting the Royal Philharmonic to record this. But each of the pieces on your album is being commissioned by semi-professional or sometimes high school or other community groups that aren't the same kind of professional full-time musicians that the Royal Philharmonic is. How do you deal with that challenge?
Oh, it's actually a challenge because Calling All Dawns, when I wrote that and I orchestrated it, I very much played it safe. Everything sits nice and comfortably in the middle register of every instrument. There's nothing. I mean, it's very simple to sight read. There's nothing that is going to throw people for a loop. With this one, because of this idea that you want to grow artistically, I've been really pushing my own writing as well as pushing the demands on the orchestra. And so there's a lot more, for example, extended technique, in the strings, and there's more things like bass trombone pedals or horn rips, 2-octave rips on the horns, things like that, pitch bends in the clarinets, various things, right? Mm-hmm. And it does present a challenge for community orchestras and so forth. But I think at the same time, most everyone that I've worked with has been up to the challenge, or they like to, be presented with a challenge, right? I mean, generally, I think the worst thing is to write a piece of music that the players find boring to play,
right? And
that happens a lot when you're taking pieces essentially written for film or video games or whatever, and then trying to transplant them to a concert stage. Writing for a recording is very different from writing for live performance, right? And so what I'm doing more of for this album is considering it as a live performance piece, because now I know that there's a market out there and people want to actually perform this music. I'm trying to give players more to do, essentially. And hopefully not drive them completely batty in the process. But I want to give them something that they can sink their teeth into a little, because that's the the common complaint that you hear on scoring stages. Oh, I'm just playing whole notes. I'm just playing footballs.
Yeah,
that's what
exactly.
They say, right?
Yeah.
And you also have to have faith too that people will rise to the challenge. You want to expect the best of people, and I do expect the best of people. And if it's a high school choir, maybe I will present a alternative version that's not so challenging or doesn't do something technique-wise that they aren't prepared for yet. I might prepare alternative versions like that, but for the most part, at the end of the day, my responsibility as a composer is to think about what is going to achieve the best artistic product in the end. And so I tend to write towards that.
So when we hear Kawakorwa on the album, how will it be different than what we're hearing it with Musica Sacra?
Not all that different. I mean,
You'll add
I'll add a tuba and another trombone, a little more percussion.
Yeah.
A couple more singing bowls, things like that. There will be throat singers as well.
Right. So more of that traditional Tibetan sound.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what I did with Kawakorwa is I tried to recreate some of the sounds that you hear in Tibetan music with instruments of the orchestra. So you have the gyaling, for example, which are they're almost like Moroccan zurnas. They're little trumpets that they play that are really loud, and they're not subtle instruments at all. And they're cacophonous, and they tend to be played by a row of monks just blasting away in their own keys. And so I tried to recreate that sound a little bit in the oboes. And there's the ragdom, the low, really deep. They're like alpenhorns.
Yeah, I was just going to say they're like alpenhorns.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the end of them sits on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. They're so long. They're about 10, 15 feet long.
Yes. The horn of Hammerhand will sound in Helm's Deep.
Right, exactly. Well, there you go. All right. Bringing up Lord of the Rings. I love it.
That's right.
I love it. Yes. So it is like, you're calling out across the mountains.
Yeah.
Gandalf is coming. The hill.
That's right. He's
Rohirrim
going
is coming to charge him. Right. But I tried to recreate that with the bass trombone. And in doing this, actually it was really great that I was working with you guys, because I would email your bass trombonist, Stephen Gehring, and I'd say, okay, this really low pedal tone here, how's this going to go? Is this going to work okay? And he was great in giving me feedback. So that's one of the other nice things about this. This whole process, with Calling All Dawns, I just went into the studio, I played it safe, right? But I just, I didn't really want to risk doing anything particularly crazy, because time is money in the studio and it's very expensive to record an album like this. With the way that I'm doing this album, with having things performed before they get recorded, I'm able to get some feedback, based on how how it sounds and things. So it's actually it's a very beneficial project for a way of working for me too.
One thing I have to say about working with you is I really appreciate how, you're working with a semi-professional group of musicians here, but you are just as interested in what we know as you would be, long-standing scholars and professional performers that are world-class and renowned. And I appreciate that that curiosity and humility.
Well, everybody knows something that I don't know, and I can learn something from everyone that I talk to. And you constantly, it's good to have different viewpoints and things like that. So it is. I try to learn something from everyone I talk to. So.
Well, it's been a real pleasure and an honor to be able to work with you.
Well, thanks.
And to commission a work from you, and to do its world premiere.
Yeah, let's keep doing this.
Well, I'm really also looking forward to hearing. We know this piece now in this context, and it's 4-minute on the stage with a bunch of unrelated pieces. I'm really interested to see how it fits in context of your concept of water throughout the...
I am too. I still have some writing to do, so we'll see.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.